The principal enemy positions in the Admiralties were on Los Negros and Manus Islands, both of which were in a precarious position at this time. Allied air power blocked the shipment of sufficient supplies to maintain a strong defence and seriously reduced the possibility of bringing in reinforcements in time to withstand an Allied attack. The feeble reaction to Allied raids offered by Japanese naval and air units demonstrated that their resistance would probably be minor and easily overcome. The question of enemy ground dispositions in the Admiralties, however, posed a different problem. Opinions differed sharply on the number of Japanese troops in the islands. Repeated air observation flights over Manus and Los Negros at the end of February reported a total lack of enemy activity. Momote Airfield was observed to be entirely unused. Even the bomb craters in the runway had been left unfilled, and grass was growing along the airstrip. Surrounding buildings and installations were seemingly unattended and in a bad state of disrepair. The continued lack of anti-aircraft fire and apparent desertion of the airstrips reported by air reconnaissance supported the inference that the Japanese had left the islands altogether. General MacArthur's G2, however, held firmly to a different opinion. On the basis of intercepted information and ground reports over a long period, the conclusion reached was that cumulative intelligence does not support air observer reports that the islands have been evacuated. On the 15th of February, the probable enemy units still on the islands were listed, and their total strength was estimated to be approximately 3,250 men. On the 24th of February, these figures were revised, and the estimate of Japanese troops in the Admiralties sector was raised to 4,000. G2 analysis discounted the significance of the lack of anti-aircraft opposition, pointing out that, prior to the Allied landing at Cape Gloucester, a similar situation was reported, but resistance was encountered to the landing and to the subsequent offensive moves. It attributed the lack of anti-aircraft fire to the deteriorated state of the enemy's logistical situation, and predicted that the enemy will hold his fire until the final defence of the Admiralties is imminent. On the 24th of February, General MacArthur directed that an immediate reconnaissance in force be made to probe the island defences by landing at Haiane Harbour on eastern Los Negros, where enemy positions apparently were weakly held. His aim essentially was to strike swiftly, achieve surprise, and thus avoid bitter fighting and heavy casualties at the beachhead. If an initial foothold could be established without undue losses, the reconnaissance force would then advance and seize Momote airstrip near the harbour entrance. If unforeseen enemy strength should be encountered at the beaches, however, and an unfavourable situation should develop, a speedy withdrawal would be carried out. In cognizance of his G2 estimates of enemy strength in the Admiralties, General MacArthur also took precautions against the eventuality of a delayed counterattack in strength. A strong auxiliary force was readied at Finschhafen, which would be sent 2 days later as reinforcements to enlarge the perimeter, if established, and to guard against any powerful Japanese reaction that might develop after the Allied landing was secured. On the morning of the 29th of February, the daring strike was launched. The reconnaissance force was light, consisting of approximately 1,000 troops of the 1st Cavalry Division supported by 2 cruisers, a dozen destroyers, and the necessary air cover. The troop units were made up mainly of a reinforced squadron of the 5th Cavalry under Brig. General William C. Chase. The naval forces were under the command of Admiral Kincaid. General MacArthur was relying almost entirely upon surprise for success, and because of the delicate nature of the operation and the immediate overall decision required, he accompanied the force in person aboard Admiral Kincaid's flagship, the Phoenix. After a preliminary air and naval bombardment, the initial landing was made on the southwest shore of Haiane Harbour under a completely overcast sky, plate number 40. A reconnaissance group of Alamo scouts, who had secretly explored the vicinity of the intended landing 2 days previously, provided valuable information on the dispositions of enemy concentrations near the harbour. The first assault waves met little opposition. Before the Japanese could recover from their surprise and swing their heavy guns, which were facing Seadler Harbour, into position, most of the troops were ashore. Working in a heavy rain against sporadic and weak enemy fire, they established a wide perimeter along the airstrip and started the preparation of defensive positions. The calculated risk had been justified. General MacArthur, coming ashore just 6 hours after the first assault wave to survey the situation, said to General Chase, "Hold what you have taken, no matter against what odds. You have your teeth in him now. Don't let go." With the scheduled arrival of the auxiliary force from Finschhafen on the 2nd of March, the perimeter could be enlarged, and the airstrip secured and prepared for incoming Allied planes. Assured of the ultimate success of the operation, General MacArthur returned to New Guinea, and his headquarters issued the following report. "We have landed in the Admiralty Islands, which stand at the northern entrance to the Bismarck Sea, almost due south of Guam and 1,300 miles from the Philippines. This marks a final stage in the great winging mole pivoting on New Guinea, which has been the basic purpose of the operations initiated on June 29, 1943, when the Southwest Pacific Area and South Pacific Area were united under General MacArthur's command. The axis of advance has thereby been changed from the north to the west. This relieves our supply line of the constant threat of flank attack, which has been present since the beginning of the Papuan campaign. This line, previously so precariously exposed, is now firmly secured not only by air coverage, but also by our own front to which it is perpendicular. The operation has been a delicate one, and its final success lays a strategically firm foundation for the future. Tactically, it tightens the blockade of the enemy's remaining bases. Their supply lines are definitely and conclusively severed, and only a minimum of blockade running by submarine or individual surface craft is now possible. In addition to the troops trapped in the Solomons, some 50,000 of the enemy, largely in New Britain and at Rabaul, are now enclosed. Their situation has become precarious, and their ultimate fate is certain under blockade, bombardment, and the increasing pressure of besieging ground forces. The end of the Bismarck campaign is now clearly in sight with a minimum of loss to ourselves. After 2 days of hard fighting, in which determined Japanese infiltration attempts and counterattacks were beaten off, the original landing force was joined on March 2nd by General MacArthur's auxiliary forces, which had arrived from Finschhafen. These reinforcements came at a timely moment. An enemy document captured early the next morning disclosed that a Japanese effort to regain Momote airfield would be made on the night of March 3rd. Hurried but thorough preparations were made for the forthcoming attack, which was expected to include most of the Japanese remaining on western Los Negros and whatever troops could be brought from nearby Manus Island. The scheduled attack came as promised. Wave after wave of tough Japanese infantry came pouring through the darkness against the Allied defences. In fierce but foolhardy charges, they sought to overwhelm each Allied position by sheer weight of numbers. When those in front were mowed down by mines and machine gun fire, the others rushed on undaunted over the bodies of their comrades, only to be cut down in turn. During the course of these suicidal banzai charges, the enemy resorted to wily and fanciful tactics. Japanese, who had somehow managed to learn the names of Allied platoon leaders, tried to trick them into misdirecting or ceasing their fire by interpolating false orders in perfect English into tapped telephone wires. One column of enemy troops came marching forward singing, for no apparent reason, "Deep in the heart of Texas." Bayonets were affixed to 5-foot poles and used as spears by the Japanese when their ammunition gave out. Bandages were discovered tied around their arms at pressure points, presumably to provide a ready tourniquet, which would permit them to continue fighting should they lose the use of either hand. It was a bizarre and bloody night, but the efforts of the Japanese, however brave, were erratic and uncoordinated. Their attacks tapered off as their dead began to litter the field of battle, and by morning the main enemy counterdrive had been decisively crushed. The cavalry forces awaited the arrival of more troops before clearing the rest of the islands. Further reinforcement echelons arrived on the 4th, 6th and 9th of March. The Allies struck out from the Momote perimeter westward to take Papitalai and northward to occupy Salami Plantation. From the latter point, they moved on across Seadler Harbour to seize Papitalai Mission and Lombrum Plantation. By March 30th, all organised enemy resistance on Los Negros had been overcome. Meanwhile, operations against the larger island of Manus had begun. On March 9th, the 2nd Brigade Combat Team of the 1st Cavalry Division under Brig General Vern D. Mudge disembarked at Salami Plantation. On March 15th, after units of the 7th Cavalry had secured the 2 small islands of Hawaii and Butjo Luo off the north coast of Manus, assault troops of the 2nd Brigade landed at Lugos Mission, 2 miles west of Lorengau. The Japanese forces, depleted by the Los Negros counterattacks, put up a stubborn but useless struggle. Lorengau airfield was captured on the 17th, and the Allied units moved on to take Rossum on the 25th. This brought an end to the campaign for the Admiralties. The success of the operation was complete. The Japanese had been powerless to present any naval opposition to the Allied landings, and their efforts in the air were sporadic and easily overcome. On the ground, G2 estimates had been remarkably accurate. It was calculated, after a count of enemy killed and captured, that the Japanese had used approximately 4,300 troops to defend the islands, substantially the force predicted in G2 estimates of enemy strength. The occupation of the Admiralties had tied the last knot in the noose around Rabaul. More than 100,000 Japanese were now choked off in the Bismarck-New Britain-Solomons area. Henceforth, the enemy was compelled to rely almost exclusively on risky submarine and destroyer runs for carrying in bare essentials. In addition, the supply route to his outer defences was pushed farther west, and the whole sea region between Truk and New Guinea was placed within Allied air range. With the threat to his right flank removed, General MacArthur could now concentrate his entire attention on the task of moving westward along the coast of New Guinea. Concurrently with the landings in the Admiralties, several lesser operations were undertaken to supplement the main Allied drives in the Bismarck and Solomon Seas areas. On March 6th, the 1st Marine Division on New Britain pushed on to take Thalassia on the Wilaumes Peninsula and then occupied the Cape Hoskins area. Most of the Japanese south of Rabaul had by this time retreated northeastward into the Gazelle Peninsula. On March 20th, Admiral Halsey's forces captured Emirau Island in the St. Matthias group. The enemy troops had been withdrawn before the landing, and the objective was gained without cost. This operation further strengthened the Allied grip on the Bismarck archipelago and, in addition, provided an excellent airbase within short range of Kavieng and Rabaul. Meanwhile, the Australians, who had been fighting vigorously on the Huon Peninsula and in the Ramu Valley, pressed westward along the New Guinea coast. Progress had been held up considerably by the steep ranges of the Finisterre Mountains, but working steadily across this natural barrier, New Guinea force moved into Bogajim on Astrolabe Bay on April 3rd. Madang was captured 11 days later, and on April 26th, the Australians occupied Alexishafen as the Japanese carried out a mass retreat to the west toward Vevak and Aitape. The sudden seizure of the Admiralties put the Allied timetable well ahead of schedule. According to the original plan, Hansa Bay was the next objective on the New Guinea coast, but in view of the spectacular success of the Admiralties landing, General MacArthur was anxious to take a longer step forward. The proposed capture of Hansa Bay would mean an advance of only 20 miles from the Allied position at Sidor, and even if the Allies occupied that base, they would still have to face the large Japanese concentrations around Wewak and Aitape. With the outcome of his operations into the Admiralties assured, General MacArthur planned a bold manoeuvre which, at one stroke, would move his forces almost 500 miles forward and at the same time squeeze some 40,000 Japanese troops between the jaws of a strong Allied vice. He would bypass Hansa Bay, bypass the enemy stronghold at Wewak, and strike well to the rear at Aitape and Hollandia. On March 5th, just 4 days after his return from Los Negros, General MacArthur submitted his daring plan to the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. Recent seizure of a foothold in the Admiralties, which will shortly be followed by complete occupation, presents an immediate opportunity for rapid exploitation along the north coast of New Guinea. To this end, I propose to make the Hollandia area instead of Hansa Bay my next objective, capturing the airfields and bases in that vicinity for further support of operations toward the Philippines. The enemy has concentrated the mass of his ground forces forward in the Madang-Wewak area, leaving relatively weak forces in the Hollandia Bay area. He is attempting to concentrate land-based air forces in the area of Western New Guinea and is developing additional fields to consolidate this area into a bulwark of air defence. SWPA land and air forces are disposed favourably to launch a 2-division reinforced assault against the objective. Preparations are being completed for the Kavieng operation, and this stronghold should fall quickly into our hands. Naval forces of SOPAC and SWPA have established surface control of the Bismarck Sea and have been augmented for the Kavieng Admiralties and Hansa Bay operations, the latter tentatively scheduled for late April. I propose that the Kavieng operation, proceeding in accordance with schedule, be followed between April 15th and 24 by an assault on Hollandia, using for the Kavieng-Hollandia operation the means of SOPAC and SWPA, as augmented for the Kavieng Admiralties and Hansa Bay operations, including coverage. For this purpose, it will be essential that the Joint Chiefs provide additional fast escort carriers and destroyers for the major task force to support this operation. The bold plan was quickly approved. General MacArthur's forces moved to execute it, and on April 20th, 1944, they struck decisively at Hollandia and Aitape, making a most important advance toward the Philippines. PT boats were ordered to conduct operations against certain points along the coast in the Hansa Bay region. Empty rubber landing boats, indicative of disembarked scouting parties, were to be left at various spots along the shores east of Wewak. Hollandia was the principal Japanese rear supply base in New Guinea. A sheltered but undeveloped harbour located on Humboldt Bay, it provided the only protected anchorage of any size between Wewak and Gilvink Bay. The airfield area, shielded from the sea by the high Cyclops mountain range, was near Lake Sentani, about 12 miles from Humboldt Bay and midway to Tanamera Bay to the west. The bulk of the enemy's remaining New Guinea air strength was based on 3 large airdromes in this area. Hollandia also served the Japanese as an important transshipment point for the unloading and transfer of personnel and cargo from large transports to smaller coastal vessels. A considerable backlog of supplies was observed on the beaches and in the vicinity of the airfields. Intelligence estimated the number of Japanese troops in the Hollandia-Aitape area at the end of March to be 15,000. At Wewak Hansa Bay, 30,000, at Wakdesarmi, 5,500, and in the Manokwari-Gilvink Bay area, 11,000. A large Allied task force was gathered in expectation of a difficult campaign. The closest teamwork of all participating components would be required to accomplish the largest operation and the longest amphibious move yet attempted in the southwest Pacific area. The projected operation involved a distance of 985 miles from Goodenough Island, the principal staging area, and over 480 miles from Cape Cretin, south of Finschhafen, the advance staging point. General Kruger, commanding general of Alamo Force, was made responsible for the coordination and planning of the ground, air, and naval forces. General Eichelberger commanded the main landing group comprising the 24th and 41st Divisions, which was to seize the Hollandia airdromes by invasions at Humboldt Bay and Tanamera Bay. Brig General Jens Doe commanded the 163rd Regimental Combat Team, which was to land in the Aitape-Taji area and capture the Taji airfield. Another combat team would be kept in reserve. The naval forces were to provide air cover and escort protection. Admiral Barbe was in charge of the naval amphibious forces, while the carrier forces of the 5th Fleet were under rear ADM, Mark A. Mitcher. The entire task force for the invasion rendezvoused north of the Admiralties, and then proceeded in a northwesterly direction toward Palau. Although this course was 200 miles longer than the direct route, it was intended to mislead the Japanese and prevent them from determining the exact objective in case of discovery by aerial reconnaissance. Swinging suddenly southward, the huge convoy approached the New Guinea coast. On the 21st of April, fast carrier planes struck the Wakdesarmi and Hollandia airfields, while the 5th and 13th Air Forces concentrated on Wewak and Hansa Bay. On the 22nd of April, after heavy preliminary naval and air bombardment, the invasion troops went ashore according to plan. Complete tactical and strategic surprise was achieved. The convoys had sailed within striking distance of their objectives, apparently without detection. The ease of the landings exceeded even the most sanguine hopes. No more than token resistance was met at any point, and there was no interference from the enemy's air or naval forces. The painstaking deception measures had been remarkably effective. In the Hollandia area, United States troops made a virtually unopposed advance. At both Humboldt Bay and Tanamera Bay, opposition to the landings was ineffective, and the two jaws of the giant invasion pincers clamped down rapidly on both sides of Mount Cyclops. So stunned was the enemy by the unexpected landings that in the beach area, complete radar sets and other valuable equipment, still uncrated, were left behind to be captured. Progress was limited only by the problems of supply and the difficult terrain, since the Japanese had failed to exploit the natural defensive positions offered by the narrow mountain defiles. On the 26th of April, the Centani, Cyclops, and Hollandia airdromes were captured. In the meantime, the Tami airstrip, lying on the coastal flat east of Humboldt Bay, was secured. With all objectives achieved, only mopping up operations and consolidation remained for the combat troops. On the 6th of June, the Hollandia phase of the operation was officially closed. At Itape, the story was much the same. On D-Day, the Taji airfield was seized and a perimeter defense was consolidated. Although there were many contacts with scattered Japanese groups, resistance was light overall. General MacArthur emphasized the strategic importance of the Hollandia-Itape operation in his official communiqué. We have seized the Humboldt Bay area on the northern coast of Dutch New Guinea, approximately 500 miles west of Sidor. Our ground troops have landed at Itape, Hollandia, and Tanamera Bay, covering a front of about 150 miles. The landings were made under cover of naval and air bombardment, and followed neutralizing attacks by our air forces and planes from carriers of the Pacific Fleet. Complete surprise and effective support, both surface and air, secured our initial landings with slight losses. We are pushing forward to secure the local airfields. Our feints over the past weeks towards Madang and Wewak apparently deceived the enemy into concentrating the mass of his forces forward into those areas, thus leaving the vital sector of Hollandia vulnerable and making possible our surprise movement to his rear. The operation throws a loop of envelopment around the enemy's 18th Army, dispersed along the coast of New Guinea in the Madang, Alexishafen, Hansa Bay, Wewak sectors, similar to the Solomons and Bismarck loops of envelopment. To the east are the Australians and Americans, to the west the Americans, to the north the sector controlled by our Allied naval forces, to the south, untraversed jungle mountain ranges, and over all, our Allied air mastery. This enemy army is now completely isolated. With its communication and supply lines severed, its condition becomes similar to that of the beleaguered 17th and 18th Armies in the Bismarck and Solomon archipelagos. Its present strength is estimated at 60,000. The total remaining forces of these two armies, which are now themselves surrounded, are estimated at 140,000, 50,000 in New Britain, 10,000 in New Ireland, 20,000 in Bougainville, and 60,000 in New Guinea. Since the start of the campaign, they have lost 110,000 men, 44% of their original strength of 250,000, and the remainder is now neutralized and strategically impotent. The enemy's maritime and air losses have been proportionately heavy. His invested garrisons can be expected to strike desperately to free themselves, and time and combat will be required to accomplish their annihilation, but their ultimate fate is now certain. The present operation, when completed, frees British New Guinea from enemy control and is the first recapture of Dutch territory in the war. Later evidence revealed that the garrison's strength in the Hollandia area closely paralleled the G2 estimate of 15,000 troops. This garrison, however, was comprised of a heterogeneous mixture of lightly armed and ill-trained service units, and failed to respond with the last-ditch type of resistance heretofore so characteristic of the Japanese. The enemy had intended to build Hollandia into a well-defended strongpoint. The service units were forerunners of the heavy fortifications and combat troops that were slated to meet an anticipated Allied drive from Hansa and Wewak. If the Allied attack had not come as soon as it did, the results might well have been different. One of the most urgent tasks after the initial assault waves were ashore was the building of dispersal and storage areas and the forcing of exits from the congested beaches. Engineer units worked rapidly and efficiently to complete high-priority construction projects. The supply track from Depapre on Tanamera Bay to the airdromes was improved to permit jeep traffic, and a road from Pim on Humboldt Bay was open for traffic as far as the Cyclops Strip by the time it was captured. For major construction, the entire Hollandia area was divided into the Hollandia, Sentani, Tanamera, Tami and dock sectors. Permanent facilities included docks, a 900-foot channel through a coral reef at Depapre, the completion and improvement of the road network, the rapid repair and improvement of captured airdromes, water supply facilities, and fuel pipelines. As roads improved and building materials became available, emphasis shifted to the construction of hospitals, camps, headquarters areas, and warehouses. All this was necessary to make Hollandia a supply base and staging area for future operations, and to establish it as the operating headquarters of the Southwest Pacific area. The WWII Taipei operation had neutralized enemy forces to the east, increased the range and effectiveness of the Army Air Forces, and gained major harbor facilities. The initial success made possible the advancement of the schedule for subsequent operations to the west, by releasing troops, ships and planes for attacks from the newly developed air and naval facilities in the Hollandia Aitape area. The seizure of Hollandia forced the Japanese to withdraw their line of defence westward to Sarmi and Biak, and reduced their communications in the New Guinea area practically to zero. Consolidation of base activities at Hollandia made it necessary to establish an Allied task force headquarters in that area. It was from here that Admiral Barbey planned and coordinated activities of the air, naval and ground forces. Although the Hollandia phase of the campaign was complete, combat continued elsewhere, including operations against the enemy at Wakde Island. Reinforcement by both air and naval forces was accomplished to meet the demands of the new theatres of operation. All forces of the Alamo Force in the region were reorganized under the direct command of General Kruger and his staff, under General MacArthur's overall command. The operations continued throughout the remainder of the war until the ultimate defeat of the Japanese forces. It was therefore decided to employ a division, less one regimental combat team, at Sarmi, and use the regimental team for the seizure of Wakde Island. Accordingly, the 63rd Regimental Combat Team of the 41st Division was directed to secure a beachhead in the Toam-Arara area, occupy Wakde Island, and protect the development of the required base construction. Wakde was too small an island to permit the direct landing of all required combat and service troops without serious congestion. Since Toam was in close range of any enemy coastal guns possibly on Wakde, it was planned to land first at Arara, and from there manoeuvre into position for the Wakde invasion. On the 7th of May, after a heavy air and naval bombardment, the 63rd Regimental Combat Team landed at Arara and established a beachhead, banked on the west by the Tor River and on the east by the Temento River, plate number 42. At the same time, a reinforced company landed without opposition on tiny Insoemanai Island, south of Wakde, to lend mortar and machine gun support. The following day, the task force went into Wakde in a shore-to-shore movement from the Toam area. Stubborn resistance from a strongly entrenched enemy was encountered, but by the 20th of May, all opposition had been overcome, and the airdrome was cleared for use. On the 9th of May, supplementary landings were made on Liki and Niroamor Islands to the west, where radar installations were rapidly established. 2 days later, the drive towards Sarmi was initiated at Toam by a landing of the 58th Regimental Combat Team. This force crossed the Tor River and, augmented by later reinforcements during June, moved forward to Maffin Airfield against strong opposition. The capture of Wakde Island provided General MacArthur with a new advance base within easy fighter range of his forward objectives, deepening his penetration of Japan's perimeter defences. All remaining enemy airdromes and harbours in New Guinea were now subject to Allied medium bomber raids. The enemy's rear areas, already dislocated and disrupted by the seizure of Hollandia, were thrown into further confusion as the Allied air, naval and ground forces continued to pound the pocketed Japanese in northern New Guinea. Biak Island lay next in the line of General MacArthur's sweeping advance. This island, 200 miles west of Wakde, possessed one of the two remaining major groups of enemy airdromes between Hollandia and Halmahera, and therefore constituted a valuable military asset to the Allied scheme of operations. On the 27th of May, just 1 week after the last enemy guns were silenced on Wakde, the 41st Division, less the 63rd Regimental Combat Team, made the first assault at Bosnek on southern Biak. Its immediate objectives were the three airdromes at Mokma, Boroko and Sorido near the southwest coast, plate number 43. Initial opposition was relatively light, and the landing force began an advance inland toward the airfields. General MacArthur described the landing operation and its strategic value as follows. "We have landed on Biak Island. The capture of this stronghold will give us command domination of Dutch New Guinea, except for isolated enemy Pantrani. For strategic purposes, this marks the practical end of the New Guinea campaign. The final stage has also been reached in the offensive initiated in this theatre on the 29th of June 1943 by the combined forces of the Southwest Pacific and South Pacific areas. It has resulted in the reconquest or neutralization of the Solomons, the Bismarcks, the Admiralties, and New Guinea. From the forward point reached by the Japanese, we have advanced our front approximately 1,800 latitude miles westward and approximately 700 miles to the north. Compared with the enemy, our offensive employed only modest forces, and through the maximum use of manoeuvre and surprise, has incurred only light losses. The operation has effected a strategic penetration of the conquered empire Japan was attempting to consolidate in the Southwest Pacific, and has secured bases of departure for the advance to its vital areas in the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies. The slight opposition to the beach landings, however, was little indication of the bitter struggle to follow, for the Japanese defence of Biak, as General Eichelberger's report described it, was based on brilliant appreciation and use of the terrain. In this instance, the enemy had purposely withheld his main forces until the United States troops had advanced to the rugged terrain beyond the beaches. Then, from the dominating cliffs and caves overlooking the moving Allied columns, the Japanese launched a savage counterattack and, aided by 5-ton tanks, succeeded in driving a block between the beachhead and invading forces. Enemy frontal pressure increased considerably, and a temporary retirement and regrouping was necessary. The situation remained critical until the remainder of the 41st Division could be brought in from Wakde to bolster the United States positions. Thus strengthened, the 41st Division renewed its drive toward Mokma at dawn on the 2nd of June, and after several days of severe and violent fighting, seized the important airdrome at Mokma on the 7th of June. Even then, the struggle continued unabated as the Japanese poured a heavy fire into the newly established airfield positions. It was another week before the strip could be brought into use. Additional United States reinforcements were sent in, and despite the enemy's fierce and valiant attempts to hold the remaining airfields at Sorido and Boroko, the two strips were finally wrested from the Japanese. Major fighting on Biak was over by the 22nd of July, although the Japanese continued sporadic resistance throughout the rest of the year. Mopping-up operations continued with amphibious shore-to-shore landings in August at Korim Bay, Wardo, and Warsaw Bay. Other landings on Suepiori Island in September brought the campaign to a close. The figure of over 7,200 enemy killed by the 20th of January 1945 indicates the tenacity with which the Japanese fought to keep Biak from falling to the Allies. With hardly a pause, General MacArthur's forces swept forward to invade nearby Ep.4 Island, west of Biak. Since strategic considerations dictated a landing on the northwest end of the island, where the enemy was judged to be strongest, the preceding air and naval bombardment was more intense than usual. Prior to and during the entire operation, naval forces maintained patrols, preventing any reinforcement of the Japanese garrisons. The 5th Air Force, now merged with the 13th Air Force under the Far Eastern Air Force, was strong enough to send 150 bombers on a single mission. For 3 weeks, ending with a record assault the day prior to the landings, the air bases at WWII and other fields nearby were continuously and heavily pounded. On the 2nd of July, troops of the 58th Regimental Combat Team landed near Kamiri Airdrome, plate number 44. Wading ashore through the surf, the landing force moved swiftly to the east, northeast, and southwest and formed a strong perimeter. By evening, Kamiri Airstrip was securely in Allied possession, and on the next day, paratroopers of the 503rd Parachute Infantry were flown in to help destroy enemy resistance and to capture the other airfields. Thus reinforced, the United States troops attacked to the northeast and seized Comosorin Airfield on the 4th of July. 2 days later, a shore-to-shore landing was made at Romboy Bay to capture the airdrome at Namba, and within 1 hour, Allied planes were operating from the airstrip. It required only 5 days after the initial assault waves hit the beaches for all the airfields on the island to be put into use, giving almost immediate breadth and depth to General MacArthur's air deployment operations. By the 7th of July, the main phases of the WWII operation were accomplished. Subsequent action was devoted to the final clearing up of enemy remnants scattered throughout the island and along the coast. Beginning with the Hollandia invasion, Japanese air and naval resistance had been uncoordinated and intermittent. Ground opposition, though stubborn, had been equally spotty. Only on Biak Island and in the Toem Sami area on the mainland had major battles developed. At these points, the isolated Japanese garrisons put up a strong and resolute resistance, necessitating the employment of comparatively large numbers of Allied ground forces supported by planes, tanks, naval gunfire and artillery. Sarmi itself was never occupied by the Allies, although between the 17th of May and the 6th of October, units of the 158th Regimental Combat Team, the 6th Division, the 31st Division, and the 33rd Division relieved each other in that area. As the Allied line moved forward after the seizure of the Mafin and Sawar airfields, the position at Sarmi lost its importance. Wakde and Toem, however, served admirably as an advanced staging area for the assaults on WWII, Sansapor and Morotai. To have mounted these operations from rear areas would have put an undue strain on General MacArthur's limited amphibious facilities and slowed down the pace of his advance considerably. While the Allied forces leapt forward from one success to another, the trapped Japanese 18th Army below Hollandia was writing the last chapters in its epic story of defeat. As the situation developed, the final phase of the Hollandia-Aitape operation, the neutralization of the large isolated enemy units, proved to be more contested than the initial stages of the invasion. The Japanese near Hollandia, and a portion of those sandwiched between Aitape and Wewak, had fled westward towards Sarmi. The greater part of these escaping troops were destroyed en route by starvation and sickness. A small fraction eventually managed to trickle into Sarmi. The rest of the enemy troops east of Hollandia joined forces at Wewak, where they remained cut off from all routes of escape to Dutch New Guinea. There, while the Allies poured in more supplies and continued to consolidate their positions, the pocketed Japanese waited helplessly and in vain for outside relief or some definite instructions from higher headquarters. After 2 months of isolated confinement, however, they could wait no longer. With their food running out, their nerves frazzled by frustrating inactivity, and with fresh Allied successes at Sarmi and Wakde making a withdrawal to Western New Guinea increasingly difficult, the Japanese decided to act. General Adachi, commanding the remnants of the once powerful 18th Army, cast aside all logic and pretense at strategy, and gave orders to make preparations for a desperate attempt to break through at Aitape. It was an almost hopeless enterprise, for any gains at Aitape would have left his troops still isolated unless they could detour around the even stronger Allied force at Hollandia. Rather than submit passively to a situation that gave every promise of eventual starvation, General Adachi chose to chance a course of positive action that might somehow constitute an impediment to Allied strategy. In an impassioned address, he exhorted his troops virtually to destroy themselves in a blind mass attack. "I cannot find any means nor method which will solve this situation strategically or technically. Therefore, I intend to overcome this by relying on our Japanese Bushido. I am determined to destroy the enemy in Aitepe by attacking him ruthlessly with the concentration of our entire force in that area. This will be our final opportunity to employ our entire strength to annihilate the enemy. Make the supreme sacrifice. Display the spirit of the Imperial Army." The preliminary movements leading to General Adachi's final attack against the Aitepe positions were picked up by General MacArthur's G2 section. Cumulative intelligence from native sources, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner of war interrogations, intercepts, perusal of captured documents, and information from ground and PT boat patrols built up so unmistakable a picture of enemy intentions that Allied forces were able to take complete countermeasures well in advance of the actual attack. Special intelligence studies and Allied forces preparation. Special intelligence studies were made available to the staffs and the troops concerned, predicting 5, the 10th of July as the date of attack and describing enemy dispositions, including the strength and identity of the forces involved. It was forecast that the Japanese contemplated employing the 20th and 41st Divisions, assisted by garrison units. The probable plan of enemy formation would consist of 2 regiments abreast, a 3rd regiment in the rear, and advance elements of the 41st Division available in the forward areas. In expectation of the coming attack, the Allied forces at Aitepe were heavily reinforced. The initial effort of the main enemy offensive took place soon after midnight on the 11th of July, as the Japanese plunged forward in a mad, suicidal rush against the Allied lines south of the mouth of the Drinyamur River. Allied machine gunners mowed down wave after wave of oncoming Japanese troops, but by sheer weight of numbers, the enemy managed to effect a small breakthrough at the point of attack. Since the ensuing assaults followed substantially the course outlined in the intelligence reports, however, the Allies were fully prepared. Artillery, already placed in position and ranged beforehand, wiped out enemy assembly points, while Allied planes kept up a continuous and accurate bombardment of supply points and routes of attack. When the Japanese were frustrated in their frontal attempt near the mouth of the Drinyamur River, they tried to pierce the Allied right flank to the south through the foothills of the Torricelli Mountains. For over a month, they battered violently against the Allied lines in the Afua region in fruitless efforts to overrun the Aitepe defences, but every drive was repulsed as the toll of enemy dead mounted sharply. Finally, on the 31st of July, the Allied forces launched a double-enveloping counteroffensive, advancing eastward to Newman Creek, and then pivoting south to encircle the enemy's rear at Afua. This counterdrive cut the Japanese into 3 main segments, leaving scattered groups west of Afua, east of the Drinyamur River, and in the Harech River area. The encircling Allied forces then hunted down and destroyed the divided enemy units in detail, virtually annihilating the remainder of General Adachi's 18th Army. By the 10th of August, all effective resistance had ceased. The scattered remnants of an utterly defeated enemy force dispersed into the mountains to congregate at Wewak and But, where they remained isolated and helpless until the close of the war. The reckless and abortive campaign had cost the Japanese heavily in killed and wounded. As General Adachi himself later gloomily acknowledged, "The story of the 18th Army is tragic. We lost 70,000 killed when we decided to attack the Allies at Aitepe." This final costly episode brought to an end the last Japanese hopes in New Guinea. Following the capture of Noamfor Island, General MacArthur's next strike was directed at the Vogelkop Peninsula, the last enemy stronghold in the New Guinea area. Adhering again to the principle of avoiding massed enemy concentrations where feasible, his forces attacked the western end of the peninsula, bypassing several thousand Japanese defending Manokwari. On the 30th of July, a task force comprising elements of the 6th Division made simultaneous and unopposed landings near Cape Opmarai on the mainland and on Middelburg and Amsterdam Islands to the northwest. Only a few enemy stragglers were encountered. The next day, a shore-to-shore landing from Cape Ep.4 was carried out at Sansepor. As in other New Guinea areas, airdrome construction proceeded rapidly. In a short time, airfields at Maar and on Middelburg Island and a floatplane base at Amsterdam Island were fully operative. The operation to seize airfield sites on the Vogelkop Peninsula advanced Allied forces another 200 miles to the west. Groups of Japanese troops moving along the coast and inland were intercepted by units of the 6th Division in the Maar-Sansepor region and at Mega, 20 miles to the southwest. Only Sorong remained as the westernmost enemy base in the Vogelkop, and its significance as a threat to Allied operations had been nullified by constant air assault. General MacArthur issued an official account of the Sansepor operation stating, "We have seized the coastal dread of Sansepor and the nearby islands of Amsterdam and Middelburg at the western tip of Dutch New Guinea, nearly 200 miles beyond Nurmfoor, and slightly more than 600 miles southeast of the Philippines." The operation was an amphibious one, the ground troops acting in coordination with naval and air forces. The enemy base at Manokwari, the pivot of the defences of the Vogelkop Peninsula, is now bypassed and useless. Its garrison, 15,000 strong, is now isolated with its only possible escape route to the south over hazardous terrain of swamp and jungle. Our air bases are now established from Milne Bay along the entire coast of New Guinea. The enemy is no longer able to operate in this area, either by air or sea, beyond the Halmahera Philippine line, which is the main defence layer for his conquered empire in the southwest Pacific. Should this line go, all of his conquests south of China will be imperilled and in grave danger of flank envelopment. The capture of Sansepor marked the successful termination of the long and hard-fought New Guinea campaign. Control of the entire stretch of coastline from Milne Bay to the Vogelkop Peninsula was now firmly in Allied hands. In less than 13 months, General MacArthur's forces, boring through layer after layer of Japan's outer defence perimeter, had moved 1,300 miles closer to the core of her island empire. The thousands of Japanese troops they had pocketed and cut off from outside aid had lost all ability to interfere seriously with Allied operational plans. When queried as to the immediate disposition of these isolated enemy segments, General MacArthur recommended that they be ignored until the main task was accomplished. The enemy garrisons which have been bypassed in the Solomon and New Guinea represent no menace to current or future operations. Their capacity for organised offensive effort has passed. The various processes of attrition will eventually account for their final disposition. The actual time of their destruction is of little or no importance, and their influence as a contributing factor to the war is already negligible. The actual process of their immediate destruction by assault methods would unquestionably involve heavy loss of life without adequate compensating strategic advantages. The present allotment of shipping and assault craft would not permit such operations except at the expense of those which are now scheduled. The Allies quickly developed their newly captured territory for immediate use. A major heavy bomber base was constructed on Biak, and fighters and medium bombers were stationed on Wakta, Nurmfoor, and at Sansepor. From these bases, the Far Eastern Air Force was to strike during the next few months at Japanese positions in Seram, Celebes, Halmahera, Dutch Borneo, Java, and the Palaus, in preparation for the assault against the Philippines. In the meantime, the Royal Australian Air Force Command was to interdict the Arafura, Banda, and Seram seas and adjacent land areas, thus protecting General MacArthur's southern flank. The New Guinea campaign, waged through broiling sun and drenching rain amid tangled jungle and impassable mountain trails, had been a difficult and grueling struggle. In combating the extraordinary problems of climate and terrain, however, many valuable lessons were learned which were to prove of great benefit in pursuing the tasks ahead. This ability to cope with crises and profit from experience was a distinguishing characteristic of the Allied conduct of the war in the Southwest Pacific. One of the important victories won by General MacArthur's forces was their triumph over the Anopheles mosquito, It was a battle involving science and discipline, waged by the troops, both officers and men, under the guidance of the Medical Corps. During the first stages of the New Guinea campaign, malaria had been as bitter and deadly a foe as the enemy. On the Papuan front, it had been responsible for more non-effectives than any other single factor. By the time General MacArthur was ready to go into the Philippines, however, it was reduced to secondary importance as a cause of disablement and no longer deserved serious consideration in planning tactical operations. This remarkable achievement, comparable with Goethals and Gorges's triumph over yellow fever, was accomplished by the cooperation of everyone who served in New Guinea. The medical department surveyed, researched, lectured, demonstrated and recommended, and General Headquarters issued the necessary directives to ensure the success of the struggle against malaria. General MacArthur appointed a special committee of representatives, authorities from both the Australian and American medical services, to formulate the general principles under which the campaign would be carried out. Medical officers and malaria control units, specially trained to cope with the menace to the Allied forces in infested areas, waged a bitter war against the mosquitoes, frequently within sound of the enemy's guns. Malariologists provided expert advice to unit commanders. Troops were educated to the dangers and prevention of malaria with posters and pamphlets, and every man was urged to wage his own personal war against the mosquitoes. The result was complete success. Japanese efforts along these same lines were not nearly so effective. Even as late as the Hollandia operation, their malaria casualties continued to assume enormous proportions, despite the fact that they had captured huge quantities of quinine in the Netherlands East Indies. As General MacArthur stated, "Nature is neutral in war, but if you beat it and the enemy does not, it becomes a powerful ally." Shortages of equipment and supply challenges, shortages of equipment and the lack of adequate shipping presented another problem, which was solved by the Southwest Pacific Command in its seizure of New Guinea from the Japanese. Many important items of equipment for both combat and service troops were in short supply right up to the end of operations. Additionally, the difficulty of handling the necessary tonnage of materiel was increased by the limited port facilities in New Guinea. Construction of bases had to be initiated almost from scratch in the native villages and missionary settlements that constituted the cities of New Guinea. Whatever facilities were needed had to be built or brought in as the forces advanced. The jungles and swamps afforded poor foundations upon which to erect the supply and operational bases necessary to carry on a war of rapid maneuver over long distances. Major construction projects were carried out in a primitive area devoid of railroads, highways, shipping facilities, and air transport. In many cases, the shipment of unit equipment from the United States was lacking in organization and completeness. The initial equipment of a single organization was often transported on many different ships, destined for discharge at various ports. This situation caused much rehandling and reshipping, contributing to the congestion which invariably occurred in all new ports during their more critical periods of development. Equipment shortages for those units about to be employed in forthcoming operations were generally overcome by crisis management. Equipment in the hands of units not scheduled for immediate combat was transferred to those troops marked for earlier action and loaded on special ships where water movement was necessary. In some instances, the troops had but little time to familiarize themselves with the weapons they were to take into battle. The lack of adequate and suitable water transportation with which to concentrate troops in staging areas and take them into combat considerably hampered the planning of operations at times. Amphibious landing craft were always critically short, and Liberty-type ships had to be used as troop transports, both for assembling troops and for moving supporting elements into objective areas. Such cargo vessels were altered to add necessary facilities by the construction of crude accommodations on deck. Movements of troops in the tropical areas of the Southwest Pacific were accomplished in a manner that would have been utterly impossible in less temperate climates. The battle against enemy shipping was another significant feature of the New Guinea campaign. The wholesale destruction by our planes, submarines, and PT boats of enemy coastal vessels, transports, barges, schooners, and sailing craft in the Southwest Pacific area gradually paralyzed enemy efforts to supply, reinforce, or evacuate the remnants of his armies cut off in New Guinea, New Britain, New Ireland, and the Solomons. More than 5,000 of these craft were destroyed. After the conclusion of the fighting in the WWII area and the Solomons, the Japanese were reluctant to risk major naval units. As a result of their heavy losses in cargo ships and transports, they were forced to devise a new supply technique. Without additional food, ammunition, and reinforcements, the Japanese forces would be unable to prevent the Allies from seizing all of New Guinea and the adjacent areas. Submarines were too small and unmaneuverable to be of more than minor aid, and moreover were too few in number. Accordingly, the enemy's most ambitious efforts along these lines were directed to a greatly expanded use of barge traffic. These barges were manufactured and collected in Japan, China, the Philippines, and various island ports, then routed to the New Guinea area. They had a troop capacity of 35 to 60 men and a cargo carrying capacity of up to 20 tons, and were generally of excellent workmanship. When the enemy's use of small craft for transportation and supply purposes began to assume serious dimensions, the Allies found it imperative to develop effective counter-tactics. The answer lay in a coordinated, intensive employment of PT boats, Catalinas, and low-flying planes. This combination destroyed the enemy's small craft much faster than they could be rebuilt. The Japanese reacted by emplacing scores of heavy-caliber shore batteries to cover their lugger and barge movements. These measures proved ineffective against the fast-striking PT boats and planes, however, and the Japanese were forced to abandon daylight traffic almost entirely. Attempts were thereafter confined to movement by night as their barges, restricted by darkness, crept furtively from cove to cove under cover of elaborate camouflage and security measures. This almost complete interdiction of all waterborne reinforcement was a major factor in the enemy's defeat in New Guinea, and demonstrated again the resourceful capabilities of the Allied forces in countering each new threat as it arose. With the end of operations in western New Guinea, the Japanese were in an extremely vulnerable position throughout the Pacific. The powerful spearhead of General MacArthur's forces now pointed menacingly only 600 miles below Mindanao. 2 whole armies had been destroyed or paralyzed, the 17th Army in the Solomons and the 18th Army in New Guinea, and the remainder of the once powerful 8th Area Army was scattered and isolated in New Britain and New Ireland. Over 250,000 Japanese troops were withering on the vine, virtually erased as a military fighting force. The unhappy strategic situation to which the Japanese had been reduced was further aggravated by Admiral Nimitz's forces, which had bypassed Truk and invaded Tinian, Guam, and Saipan in the Marianas, thus tightening the Allied ring around Japan's inner zone of defence. In southwest New Guinea and the Netherlands East Indies, the Allied air forces had so successfully neutralised the areas around the Arafura, Banda, and Seram seas that it became unnecessary to carry out ground actions in those regions. Japan's air forces beyond the Philippines had been swept from the skies. The constant and implacable pressure exerted by the Allied air forces gradually eliminated the enemy's air resources in the southwest Pacific. Thousands of planes had been destroyed along with experienced pilots and crewmen. Huge stocks of valuable equipment, supplies, and ammunition, which the Japanese could not replace, had been completely lost. General MacArthur's conduct of operations along the New Guinea axis had not only yielded large stretches of enemy holdings, but had also kept Allied losses in the southwest Pacific to an extraordinarily low level. By adhering closely throughout his campaign to the 4 basic principles of war, the principles of mass, surprise, economy, and objective, adherence to a master plan, he had achieved maximum gains in territory with minimum losses in combat. While Japan's whole defence structure was being rocked to its very foundations, General MacArthur was preparing even stronger blows. The vexing problems of logistics had been largely solved. His newly captured bases, with steadily increasing stockpiles of materiel, now assured adequate supplies for his projected drive forward into the heart of the enemy's Pacific possessions, the Philippines. The Philippine Islands constituted the main objective of General MacArthur's planning from the time of his departure from Corregidor in March 1942 until his dramatic return to Leyte 2.5 years later. From the very outset, this strategic archipelago formed the keystone of Japan's captured island empire, and therefore became the ultimate goal of the plan of operations in the Southwest Pacific area. After the Philippines were liberated, they would form the main base for the final assault against the Japanese homeland. As the Allies advanced westward along New Guinea and across the Central Pacific, a wide divergence of opinion developed among international planners and military strategists on the methods of defeating Japan. However, General MacArthur never changed his basic plan of a steady advance along the New Guinea-Philippine axis, from Port Moresby to Manila. This plan was conceived as a forward movement of ground, sea and air forces, fully coordinated for mutual support, operating along a single axis with the aim of isolating large Japanese forces that could be attacked at leisure or slowly starved into surrender. By choosing the route from Australia via New Guinea and the Halmaheras to the Philippines, General MacArthur could constantly keep his lines protected, pushing his own land-based air cover progressively forward with each advance. His plan ensured control of the air and sea during major amphibious operations, and was designed so that land-based air power, with its inherent tactical advantages, could be used to the maximum extent. This remained his fundamental concept of operations as he moved his forces from Port Moresby and Milne Bay to Buna and Ley, through the Vitiaz Straits to the Admiralties, on to Hollandia and the Vogelkop, until they reached their final springboard at Morotai. The first overall plan naming the Philippines as a final objective for the Southwest Pacific area was prepared by General MacArthur's G3 planning staff at the conclusion of the Buna campaign early in 1943. Called the Reno Plan, it formed the basis for ensuing operations against the Japanese, although it was to undergo several changes during the course of the Pacific War. Reno I was based on the premise that the Philippine archipelago, lying directly athwart the main sea routes from Japan to the sources of her vital raw materials and oil in the Netherlands Indies, Malaya and Indochina, was the most important strategic objective in the Southwest Pacific area. Whoever controlled the air and naval bases in the Philippine Islands logically controlled the main artery of supply to Japan's factories. If this artery were severed, Japan's resources would soon dry up, and her ability to maintain her war potential against the advancing Allies would deteriorate to the point where her main bases would become vulnerable to capture. The choice of routes to the Philippines was narrowed down until an advance along the northwest coast of New Guinea was selected as providing the best opportunities for the full coordination of General MacArthur's air, ground and naval forces. Extensive use would be made of airborne and parachute troops, seizing certain key bases and leapfrogging past others. Mindanao was selected as the tactical objective area in the Philippines, and the flanks of the Allied advance beyond the western tip of New Guinea were to be safeguarded by air and naval neutralization of Palau and Ambon. During the course of 1943, the fast-changing combat situation necessitated several alterations in the original Reno Plan. In August, Reno I was succeeded by Reno II, and in October, still further modifications were published in Reno III. At that time, General MacArthur had driven past Finschhafen and had penetrated the enemy's New Guinea defences to a depth of over 300 miles. The strategy of his advance was briefly outlined in a memorandum to the War Department. "This advance," he stated, "is along a decisive operational axis that drives a wedge into the Japanese defense perimeter toward a central core, the Philippines, that dominates all aerial and shipping lanes employed by the enemy for his current reinforcement and maintenance program. The establishment of Allied forces in the Philippines would not only cut Japan's communications with the islands on which she was dependent for the means to run her war machine, but would also provide an ideal base from which to prepare the final blows against Tokyo itself." General MacArthur continued his analysis with an appraisal of the various approaches to the Philippines. He considered that an attack from the Southeast Asia Command would be frontal in nature, pushing the Japanese back upon successive lines of defense, which they could readily keep supplied. A major effort along this line of action, he concluded, is undesirable both tactically and logistically. An attack across the Pacific would also have to be delivered against a position organized in great depth. It would have to be supported entirely by carrier-based aircraft as opposed to land-based air cover, and it would not sufficiently cut the enemy's lines of communication nor seriously curtail his war potential. A drive from the southwest Pacific area, on the other hand, possessed several advantages, which General MacArthur explained as follows. The attack from the southwest Pacific area departs from a base that is closest to the objective and advances against the most lightly organized portion of the enemy's defenses, effecting a decisive penetration. It is the only plan that permits an effective combination of land, sea, and air power. The advance can be made by a combination of air and sea operations, always supported by the full power of land-based aviation and assisted by the fleet operating in the open reaches of the Pacific. A penetration of the defensive perimeter along this line results in bypassing heavily defended areas of great extent that will fall, practically of their own weight, to mopping up operations with a minimum of losses. He agreed that if the forces were available, it would be advantageous to attack in force along each line of advance, but he maintained that the paucity of means in the initial stages, particularly in amphibious craft, should limit the Allies to a single drive in full strength. To attempt a major effort along each axis, he stated, would result in weakness everywhere, in violation of cardinal principles of war, and would result in failure to reach the vital strategic objective at the earliest possible date, thus prolonging the war. Concentration on the most advantageous route of advance, with a powerful drive forward, was in General MacArthur's view the surest way to an early victory. By March of 1944, Southwest Pacific Area (SWPA) forces had landed in the Admiralties, and Central Pacific forces had won positions in both the Gilberts and the Marshalls. Parallel drives converging upon the Philippines and Formosa from both the Southwest Pacific and Pacific Ocean areas appeared to be possible. The strategic objectives, set forth under a new Reno 4 plan, were expanded to include the securing of land, naval, and air bases in the southern Philippines, from which to launch an attack upon Luzon in the north. Bases in Luzon would, in turn, be used for the support of subsequent Allied assaults against the Formosa China coast area. The spring and summer of 1944 saw accelerated action in the war against Japan, as the Allied advance gathered greater momentum. In the latter part of March, naval task force strikes were carried out against Palau, Yap, and Wala'i, and at the end of April, a heavy and damaging carrier raid was made on Truk. SWPA forces, meanwhile, invaded Itape and Hollandia, and during May assaulted Wakde and Biak. On June 15th, Central Pacific forces invaded Saipan in the Marianas to begin construction of a base for the mighty B-29 bombers. The Allied forces were fast reaching tactical positions from which to launch a powerful offensive into Japan's main lines of defense. Again, the question arose as to the best points of attack and the most advantageous routes of approach. Various proposals were put forth for bypassing certain previously planned objectives or for bypassing all objectives short of the Japanese home islands themselves. Other plans advocated the use of long-range bombing from the Marianas to force the Japanese into surrender. Still, others considered bases in China necessary to accomplish the task, with landings to be made along the China coast from positions in the Philippines. The suggestion was made that Western New Guinea, Halmahera, and the Palaus be bypassed for an immediate blow at the Philippines. Another plan advocated the capture of airfields in the southern Philippines, and then striking directly at Formosa, and finally a proposal was put forth to take the Philippines as a base for an assault straight into Kyushu, the southernmost of the 4 Japanese home islands. Certain of these proposals were discarded upon further study as entailing too great a risk, with the possibility that failure would delay the conclusion of the war by many months. Other suggestions appeared to be more time-consuming and costly in men and materials than substitute objectives which might be found. The plan to force Japan to surrender by strategic bombing would undoubtedly require supplementing with the actual territorial conquest of numerous vital areas. Throughout the strategic planning on ways and means to defeat Japan, General MacArthur held firmly to his original concept. In view of the overall situation in the summer of 1944, he considered that the route through Halmahera and the Palaus into the southern Philippines and thence to Luzon was the most feasible approach to the Japanese homeland. It permitted an advance that could move under the cover of land-based air power from start to finish, with a minimum of risk and with every assurance of success. This route would also take advantage of the large Philippine guerrilla forces that were already furnishing valuable intelligence and waiting impatiently to assist in ousting the enemy. Aside from military considerations, moreover, the liberation of the Philippines was a duty that General MacArthur felt had to be fulfilled as soon as possible. He outlined his views in a radio to the War Department a few days after completing the final draft of his Reno V plan. In my opinion, purely military considerations demand the reoccupation of the Philippines in order to cut the enemy's communications to the south and to secure a base for our further advance. Even if this were not the case, and unless military factors demanded another line of action, it would, in my opinion, be necessary to reoccupy the Philippines. It is American territory, where our unsupported forces were destroyed by the enemy. Practically all of the 17 million Filipinos remain loyal to the United States and are undergoing the greatest privation and suffering because we have not been able to support or succor them. We have a great national obligation to discharge. I feel that a decision to eliminate the campaign for the relief of the Philippines, even under appreciable military considerations, would cause extremely adverse reactions among the citizens of the United States. The American people, I am sure, would acknowledge the obligation. General MacArthur's views regarding the approach to the Philippines met with general acceptance, and early in July 1944, joint staff conferences were held with representatives of the Central Pacific area to prepare detailed studies for the preliminary operations. Coordinated assaults were scheduled for Morotai in the Moluccas and certain islands in the Western Carolines. In the former operation, SWPA forces were to be aided by naval units of the Pacific Fleet, while in the latter task, bombers from the SWPA were to assist in attacks on Palau, Yap, and Ulithi. With these positions in Allied hands, the way would then be clear for the actual invasion of the Philippines. The first version of the overall plan for the conduct of the Philippines campaign was published under the name Musketeer by GHQ SWPA on the 10th of July 1944. The chief objectives of Musketeer 1 were the destruction of hostile forces in the Philippines and the prompt seizure of the central Luzon area to provide air support and naval bases for possible operation of POA forces in the China Coast Formosa area. This plan, like Reno IV, provided for an Allied advance along the eastern shores of the Philippines to establish bases for a final attack on Luzon. Initial lodgements were to be made at Sarangani Bay in southern Mindanao on the 5th of November and at Leyte Gulf on the 20th of December. Except for these preliminary operations, however, Mindanao and the Visayas were to be bypassed and not consolidated until after the occupation of Luzon was completed. Musketeer the coup of the 29th of August 1944 enlarged on the original plan and had as its major objective the prompt seizure of the central Luzon area to destroy the principal garrison, command organization, and logistic support of hostile defense forces in the Philippines, and to provide bases for further operations against Japan. The plan envisioned the full support of the U.S. fleet not only to secure a foothold on the eastern coast of the Philippine archipelago, but also to assist in the invasion of central Luzon. The main effort in the Central Plains Manila area was integrated into the Lingayen operation and set for the 20th of February 1945. A supporting operation to land at Dingalan Bay in the eastern Luzon area was contemplated for the first part of March. The invasion dates of the 5th of November for Sarangani Bay and the 20th of December for Leyte Gulf remained unchanged. A sudden change in the battle picture of the Pacific Theatre led to a drastic revision of Allied strategy as set forth in the Musketeer plans. On 9, the 10th of September, Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet carrier-borne aircraft, giving strategic support to impending landings on Morotai and Palau, hit Mindanao and discovered unexpected and serious weakness in the enemy's air defences of that area. Few Japanese planes were encountered, and further probing disclosed that Southwest Pacific land-based bombers, operating out of New Guinea fields, had caused severe damage to enemy air installations on the island. Immediate orders were issued to capitalize on the enemy's apparent aerial weakness. The Allies moved on beyond Mindanao, and carrier task groups of the Third Fleet sortied northward to hit the Visayas on 12 and the 13th of September. Again, enemy air reaction was surprisingly meagre, and heavy loss was inflicted upon Japanese planes and ground installations. It became more and more apparent that the bulk of the once mighty Japanese Air Force had been destroyed in the costly war of attrition incidental to the New Guinea operations. The disclosure of such great vulnerability in the enemy's air shield over the Philippines caused an immediate reassessment of the situation to ascertain whether an acceleration of the existing schedule would be possible by omitting certain previously planned operations designed mainly for air support. Intelligence sources indicated that the Japanese had been increasing their ground forces in the Philippines. With the enemy thus strengthening his positions to meet the anticipated Allied assaults, each month or week that could be cut from the Allied timetable for the Philippines would accordingly reduce the overall cost of the campaign and help ensure its rapid accomplishment. On the 13th of September, Admiral Halsey advised Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur that he believed the seizure of the Western Carolines, including Palau, was no longer essential to the occupation of the Philippines. He suggested that Leyte could be seized immediately if all projected operations in the Carolines, with the exception of Ulithi, were cancelled and the landings were covered by carrier aircraft. Admiral Nimitz concurred in the proposal to bypass Yap, but directed that the Palau and Ulithi operations be carried out as scheduled, the former being needed as an airbase and the latter as a fleet anchorage. Admiral Halsey's recommendation was relayed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were then participating in the Quebec Conference between President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill. General MacArthur's views were requested on the proposed change of the invasion date for Leyte, and the reply came back as follows. In view of Comgerd Felty's latest report on carrier operations in the Philippines land area, I am prepared to move immediately to execute King II, Leyte, with a target date of the 20th of October 44. The advance planning and the preparation of alternative solutions, which were standard operational procedure for General MacArthur's staff, again, as in the case of Hollandia, permitted the necessary flexibility for rapid change. Accordingly, with the assurance that the SWPA forces could conform to the proposed change in schedule, the target date for the Leyte landing was advanced fully 2 months ahead of the original schedule. Other important decisions were made in rapid order. Preliminary operations, such as the seizure of Talaud, Yap, Misamis Occidental, and Sarangani, were cancelled. The Palau and Morotai operations, still considered necessary for air support and flank protection against thrusts from the mandated islands, or from Halmahera and the Celebes, remained scheduled for the 15th of September. The landing on Ulithi, to secure a forward area logistics support base for the fleet, was planned for the 23rd of September. The sustained air assaults of the Far Eastern Air Force against hostile bases in the Netherlands East Indies, together with Allied landings on Biak, Noamphur, and Sansapor, had greatly weakened the enemy stronghold at Halmahera. His airfields there and at contiguous intermediate bases were almost wholly neutralized, his maritime forces largely interdicted, and his ground troops immobilized in almost static helplessness. The flexibility of the Halmahera base, from which he once funneled his forces to strategic outposts, was now completely destroyed. If he failed to retrieve his position, one of the main lines of defence protecting the Philippines and the Netherlands East Indies was gravely threatened. Intelligence sources revealed that, beginning in June 1944, the Japanese had displayed considerable interest in the defence of Morotai at the northern tip of Halmahera, but that little had been accomplished, presumably because other areas were placed higher on the list of probable Allied objectives. With its small garrison, Morotai offered an excellent opportunity for securing a base without prolonged fighting or heavy losses. It fitted well into General MacArthur's scheme of winning important positions by attacking weakly held but strategically valuable points. Additional information indicated that, while the Japanese strength on Morotai was relatively weak, the island could be substantially reinforced by barge and transport traffic with troops from Halmahera within 48 hours, and from the Philippines within a week. The full weight of Allied air power was thrown against the Japanese to forestall any reinforcement efforts. Medium and heavy bombers of the Southwest Pacific area struck airdromes on Mindanao, Halmahera, and the Netherlands East Indies, while fighters attacked and strafed defence installations, shipping, and troop concentrations. The fast carriers of the Third Fleet hit Chichijima and Iwo Jima in the Bonins, and Mindanao and the Visayas in the Philippines, with repeated raids between the 31st of August and the 4th of September. Hostile aircraft were confined to the northern Philippines and to the southern Celebes. Air and naval bombardment of shore positions on Halmahera, as well as Morotai, preceded the landings at Pitoe Bay on the 5th of September. An Alamo task force was composed of the 31st Division and the 126th Regimental Combat Team of the 32nd Division, plus supporting combat and service troops directed by 7th Corps. 7th Amphibious Force convoys carrying the assault troops were protected by escort carriers and land-based fighters as they moved from Aitepe and Toem. General MacArthur went with his troops and viewed the bombardment of Galela on Halmahera from aboard the cruiser Nashville, and later went ashore on one of the beachheads. A description of the landing appeared that day in the communiqué of the Southwest Pacific Headquarters. "We have landed in the Halmaheras 300 miles beyond New Guinea. Our ground forces, under cover of naval and air bombardment, seized beachheads on the island of Morotai, the most northern of the Halmahera group. The point of landing was unexpected, the enemy having apparently anticipated it in the lower parts of the islands where he had accumulated very strong forces in heavily defended positions. In bypassing these forces and landing farther to the north, he was taken by surprise, and his initial resistance is being rapidly overcome. Our ground losses up to the present time have been very light, and we have had no naval or air losses. The main objectives on Morotai were reached by the 6th of September, and ground activities were limited to mopping up and extending the beachhead perimeter. Air warning systems were set up, beach defences coordinated, anti-aircraft weapons brought into position, and PT boats put on night patrol duty. By the 21st of September, the Allies had established a firm position on Morotai, and work was started immediately on facilities for pushing the offensive forward.